Welcome, nerd. Yes, it is here, finally. I know you guys have been asking for it for a long time. The transformation of Marko Ninkovic, one of my mentees that has had a pretty cool transformation amongst others, but this one particularly kind of blew up online, and many of you guys have just wanted to see exactly how that worked on a tangible level, and that is exactly what I'll be doing in this video. I will be providing a full and detailed exploration, deep dive on what our process looked like on the psychological side of things and on the physical side of things to get him from a skinny fat basement dweller, this is what Marko looked like when he actually started working with me, to, well, I don't really need to say much. Yeah, so I won't waste any of your time. On the right side, this is me being a little bit schizo with my Apple Pencil, just to give you guys a little a bird's eye view, for lack of a better way to put it, of how this actually looked. And on the left is what I'll actually be the exposition itself, which I will be reading. So, the architecture of transformation. When Marko came to me, his presenting problem was what you might expect. He was skinny fat, trapped in work that felt meaningless, and chronically online in the way that suggests deeper avoidance patterns. But the real issue, the one worth examining, was architectural. And so this is what Marko looked like, obviously before. This is not what he looked like when he started working with me. This was him in his childhood. But what's important about this photo is a lot of Marko's negative psychological manifestations stemmed from this photo. This is Marko when he actually was working with me. Obviously, he was older, but this photo is particularly important to me and to include in this because we all have parts of our childhood that are responsible for many of our negative behaviors that we are not necessarily consciously aware of. And the work that I do in my mentorship is actually to really uncover what that looks like, what those memories look like, and how our negative behaviors that are manifest outcomes of those memories are necessarily connected to those memories, right? We want to find the connection and be able to rewrite that narrative in a way that is, that requires there's a very specific way to do it, and it is painful and intense, and that is what I will be explaining. So, Marko had constructed no genuine anchor for who he was becoming. There was no integration between his stated aspirations and how his nervous system actually organized his daily experience. This is, I would argue, the fundamental predicament of our time. We mistake the symptoms of poor identity architecture for problems that can be solved with better habits. The first intervention was not what most would expect, not a workout protocol or dietary restriction, but something meaningfully deeper, a systematic examination of his patterns to identify their origins. This was accomplished through a dual audit. And so the dual audit was a psychological audit and a physical audit. Obviously, the psychological audit is what really holds all of the pain and the wounds and what I actually like to dive into prior to even moving on to the physical audit. So he completed my psychological audit and the physical audit. The psychological audit is the critical diagnostic. It reveals whether he has an anchor, so a genuine North Star that feels emotionally real, and whether he has integration with his shadow material, meaning his unconscious patterns are mapped and managed rather than running him. And your subconscious mind is probably running your behaviors, which is why you continue to self-sabotage. The physical audit is secondary, but obviously useful. It maps sleep, nutrition, training history, and stress load, giving me behavioral data to work with. Marko had neither anchor nor integration, so this is where we started. And again, that's just shown right here. So, week 0, foundation and diagnosis. Once the audits were complete, I constructed Marko's initial behavioral protocol in the background. This meant his training, his diet, his recovery, designed around his current capacity, not his fantasy self. Obviously, if you guys know me, you probably know what I look like. I obviously know my shit when it comes to the gym. I have 2 years of background in biomedical sciences. I understand the physiology of the human body quite well, and I just know how to properly conduct and create physical regimens to achieve dream physiques, right? And obviously it worked with Marko. You guys saw his transformation. I'm not in biomedical sciences anymore, FYI. I'm now doing a dual major. I'm in my 5th year of my dual major in neuropsychology and philosophy. And the intersection of all three, neuroscience, psychology, and philosophy, is what this mentorship actually is. I built it from the ground up. And yeah, I think it's pretty fucking cool because I don't really think, I really just take from things that I think work in all of these realms of knowledge, whether it's neuroscience, psychology, or philosophy, and I integrate them into one thing, which is elevation, my mentorship. So the purpose of this phase is straightforward. Provide the body with a stable, predictable container so we can work at the identity layer without its physiology constantly hijacking the process. Simultaneously, his audit revealed what I suspected. He had no future self that registered as believable to his nervous system. He possessed vague aspirations, but nothing that could function as an attractor state for sustained behavioral change. When this is the case, I always establish the anchor first. Shadow work is premature until there exists somewhere for the psyche to reorganize toward. So phase 1 was the future self narrative, and this is what we started with. I saw that Marco lacked an anchor. He didn't really have a North Star. He didn't know where he wanted to go, right? He was very lost. He was depressed. He was not only depressed, he was working a 9 to 5, he was broke, he was skinny fat, and he just didn't know. Like, even when I would ask Marco and I saw in his audit, he just didn't know where he wanted to go. And that was that's a huge indicator to me that you need an anchor before you even do any sort of psychological work, right? So the future self narrative, using my actual framework, which the framework that I use and the framework that I created is this. I kind of explain exactly how the future self narrative is supposed to be conducted. That was given to Marco. I explained it to Marco so that he could actually begin the process of transformation. So weeks 1 to 2, installing the anchor and opening the shadow. In week 1, I guided him through my future self narrative framework. The future self narrative, we're going to call it the FSN, is not vision boarding or manifestation thinking, although both of these can be useful if done properly. It is a structured autobiographical script of who you become, written in the past tense or present tense, with precise detail across body, mind, relationships, work, and meaning. It must be emotionally immersive enough that the brain cannot continue treating it as fiction. After reviewing and refining his initial narrative, we established a daily rehearsal protocol. From that point forward, every morning he rehearsed the story of his future self instead of replaying the narrative of his failures. Once the anchor was secured, we opened the basement to the shadow, the Jungian shadow. Put that in here, actually. Carl Jung is a Swiss psychiatrist, psychoanalyst, has many cool theories, one of them being the shadow. He talks about the ego, the shadow, the persona, the anima, animus, all of these cool things. And I've been fascinated by the shadow for a long time. Shadow work changed my life, and it has changed the lives of many of my mentees, and this is really what holds the key to transformation and understanding yourself, becoming whole, right? You must become whole before you transform. In order to transform, you must become whole. So we initiated Jungian shadow work through 2 structured sessions. The shadow work consisted of a personal letter from me, analyzing his patterns and identifying where his adaptive strategies had turned against him. It also included targeted prompts to surface avoided material and a philosophical framework explaining why we deliberately enter the darkness, not for catharsis alone, but to reclaim energy trapped in repression. By week 2, he possessed a solid future self narrative under daily rehearsal, had completed 2 shadow initiation sessions, and maintained a behavioral protocol on the physical side. The anchor was established and the door to the shadow was opened. So that's kind of what it looked like here. This is when we did our first 2 sessions. And again, within the shadow work, I would give in specific insights and philosophical frameworks provided in the letter. Obviously, in week 0, this is when I gave him his full behavioral protocol. So his training, his diet, and his recovery, which were ongoing during the entire mentorship. Weeks 3 and 4, shadow mapping and first breakthroughs. Week 3 marked where the work became genuinely interesting. Using material from his initial shadow session, I mapped recurring motifs, shame loops, avoidance rituals, compensations, and hidden resentments. We progressed through sessions 3 and 4, shifting from exposure to organization. Shadow integration begins here. We are no longer merely naming the monsters, we are understanding what function they have performed. Around this time, this is where Marco experienced his first major behavioral breakthrough. Moments that historically triggered automatic checkout behavior, like late night scrolling, comfort eating, work sabotage, and other dopamine-seeking behaviors, became visible to him in real time rather than only in retrospective analysis. This visibility signals that the shadow material is entering conscious awareness, right? So again, it was around shadow session 3 where he had his first really big behavioral breakthrough. And since we now have shadow material to work with, we can now begin the integration of shadow material. And this is where his self-sabotage significantly declined and his identity thermostat increased. And if you guys don't know what the identity thermostat is, this is, I guess, the foundation of all of my frameworks and beliefs, which is you right now are set at a certain temperature. Your identity is set at a certain temperature. And no matter what you do in your outer world, no matter what actions you take, you will always regress back to whatever this temperature is. This is why, let's say when you gain weight or when you lose weight successfully, let's say you're on a diet and you lose weight. So you see this increase in your outer world, this good stuff happens, right? Or let's say you win a lottery or you enter a really good relationship that seems too good to be true. You will always regress back to whatever identity temperature that you've subconsciously set yourself at. And this is why we see endless occurrences of self-sabotage and of regression, and why you have been trying your entire life to change, but you always snap back to what you used to be. And this really can be one of the most painful things that anyone can experience. I know what it feels like. I used to be bulimic. I used to suffer with crippling anxiety. And one of the big truths that I realized in my hardship was the truth of the identity thermostat, something that I've came up with, but I think it's quite clear. And you see similar sorts of notions in books like Psycho-Cybernetics, which I actually didn't know about, funny enough, until after I came up with all of this. And then Psycho biological cybernetics was introduced to me because somebody said my frameworks were quite similar. So back to the shadow work. To stabilize this development, I introduced two tools: mismatch audits, level 1 mismatch audits, and situational awareness cards. And mismatch audit at level 1 forces you to list without self-deception all the ways your daily behavior contradicts the identity you claim to be building. Situational awareness cards are micro future narratives tied to specific triggers, providing immediate counterscripts when old patterns activate, okay? And so by week 4, we had exposed deeper shadow material partially mapped to his self-sabotage patterns and witnessed clear evidence that his behavior was beginning to align with the new anchor, which was really fucking cool. Weeks 5 to 8. Week 5 accomplished two crucial components. And just in case you guys didn't actually see, these were the mismatch audits and the situational awareness cards. And yeah, this is when we get into week 5. So two crucial developments were made. First, we define invariance and the lag rule. Invariants are non-negotiable behaviors that define the new identity regardless of emotional weather. And the lag rule establishes that external results trail internal reconfiguration, right? And so back to this whole concept of the identity thermostat, your inner world, your identity, and your outer world will always match. They will always come back to each other, no matter what. So if you increase the temperature of your identity, if you actually better your identity, your outer world will follow. The amount of money in your bank account will follow. The amount of fat that you have on your body will drop. All of these things follow your identity. It's not the other way around. And if the outer world does happen to have an increase without your identity changing, you will see regression back to where you were, okay? Second, we refined his future self narrative into version 2, adjusting the pacing of his ideal day, the emotional tone of his life, and the granularity of his self-image to provide his nervous system with a cleaner signal. We also developed a secondary complete future self narrative, an alternative identity trajectory he could rehearse depending on context, right? Future self narratives can actually get pretty complex, funny enough, where you can actually create narratives for different versions of yourself that you want to be with regards to specific behaviors that you don't like about yourself. And so you can counter those behaviors through future self narratives. And by the way, the future self narrative operates through the mechanism of neuroplasticity, which is why it actually works if you if you follow the right frameworks though, right? So this allowed Marco to inhabit different versions of his future self, one optimized for depth and mastery, and another for social presence and influence. The ability to alternate between these narratives prevented rigidity while maintaining coherent identity development. And so in parallel, we intensified the shadow work through sessions 5 and 6. His self-sabotage dropped markedly. With a clear narrative anchor and a map of the shadow patterns, his identity thermostat began to rise, which I explained right here. The identity thermostat is the internal set point for what level of success, love, and power you unconsciously allow yourself to sustain before automatically sabotaging it. Pretty much what I said earlier. We also introduced embodied affirmations, not statements mumbled before mirrors, but sentences wired into specific postures, breathing patterns, and micro behaviors, so the declaration becomes integrated into the body, not merely the intellect. This is very important to know, guys. Embodied affirmations are not just this bullshit thing where you just scream in the mirror. There are ways to do affirmations, and there are ways that we see actually work on the level of the brain and can cause real changes in your neural circuits, which change obviously the way that you will behave, and that just leads to transformation. I think people like to overcomplicate transformation. Really what it is neuroplasticity, right? You can say all these woo-woo things about what transformation might be, but really it just comes down to rewiring your brain in a certain way so that you can actually just act in accordance with certain behaviors, and so that these behaviors are just natural downstream byproducts and manifestations of your identity. You can wire your brain in a way to support an identity, to provide the foundation of an identity. And that soil that you place, that soil of identity, is the same soil in which the behaviors will stem from, right? The plants represent the behaviors. And as long as the soil is rotten, right? As long as you have the wrong identity, you will never be able to sustain change because the soil needs to be changed. The plants will just continue to die until you change the soil, right? So this is what identity work is. It's about fundamentally changing how your brain is wired. You're a physicalist and you really like how this works on the physical level, then I can speak your language. My background's in neuropsychology. I understand the brain quite well. You are just rewiring how the brain is wired. When you do that, two different people with two different identities have markedly different brains. And just to loop this whole circle, this is why certain behaviors are just hard, because your neural wiring just is fundamentally incompatible with those behaviors, especially when looked at from a long-term perspective. So from week 6 onward, we established weekly Bayesian reviews. Each week, we updated his beliefs based on fresh evidence rather than clinging to outdated self-narratives. When data demonstrated his capacity for consistent training, deep work, or social presence, that evidence was forced into the identity model. This prevents the old self-concept from ignoring the new reality. By week 6, Marco had completed 6 shadow sessions, experienced several serious breakthroughs, and possessed a much clearer understanding of the unconscious forces that had been directing his life. By this point, most people have a very clear understanding of what their psyche actually looks like and a better understanding of why they're acting the ways that they're acting, right? So the Bayesian reviews, this term Bayesian, where does it come from? Essentially, it's this term that comes from math, Bayes' theorem, which has to do with the prediction of certain outcomes and how likely a certain outcome is to be the result of certain inputs from as far as I'm aware. And this just applies, I just took the term and just applied it to identity change, where you can actually just, if you continue to change the inputs, right? And if you really force those inputs into your identity schema and really make yourself realize that these old inputs are no longer true, then the predictions that you have about your future and about yourself and about your own identity begin to change. Same goes for mismatch audits. This is something that actually comes from finance, but again, I just stole it and just brought it to neuroscience, where you're actually just looking at like the trigger and the behavior that results from a trigger and the rationalization after the trigger and the mismatch between the behavior and your identity statement that you have about yourself and the cognitive dissonance that arises. And yeah, anyways, that's not for this video. So week 8 to 11. So as we can see, and so now we can see here that Marco's shadow was really comprehensively mapped. So by week 8, we introduce identity statements and my adaptation of Jim Rohn's reasons framework. Identity statements are distilled sentences that capture the essence of the new self in language that feels both dangerous and honest. They are commitments, not slogans. The reasons framework forces articulation of why this transformation actually matters, right? Not in the vague personal development language, but in concrete, sometimes uncomfortable terms. The relationships that will deteriorate if you remain unchanged, the future that you refuse to tolerate, the life that you are willing to suffer for. Jim Rohn, many of you guys probably know Jim Rohn, is one of my favorite speakers, a very wise guy. And he talked about how the importance of reasons, and his sort of just talk on reasons kind of changed my life, where I began to write down all of my reasons. And I developed a little bit of a framework on how to write down your own reasons so that you can really have direct access to why you are trying to transform. I think having direct access to reasons is just, it's so important. You need to know. And a lot of you think that you have your reasons, like, yeah, I want to become rich, or no, like, what are your deep reasons? Like, is it for you? Is it because you don't respect yourself? Is it for somebody else? You need to write down everything. If you have access to everything, again, even the act of writing is just so important, which is why so many of my protocols are writing based, like the future self narratives, cathartic release journaling, Jungian shadow work, etc. And so speaking of cathartic release, this phase included our first cathartic release session. Cathartic release journaling is a guided protocol allowing the nervous system to complete emotional loops it has held open for years. When executed properly, it is not mere venting, but a structured discharge of stored affect that liberates cognitive and behavioral bandwidth. This was a very important finding for me, and it was pretty life-changing. And so on the physical side, behavioral phase 2 commenced. So this is now where his training intensity increased, his diet became more precise, and recovery was just formalized. And because his identity thermostat continued to shift and had shifted before, all these things just felt less like white knuckle discipline and more like natural alignment. And so from weeks 8 to 11, we just continued what we were doing, which was ongoing shadow work, future self-narrative rehearsals, weekly Bayesian reviews, and increasingly sophisticated integration exercises. Marco began noticing something remarkable. Discipline felt less like a scarce resource. He no longer needed to manufacture motivation for basic behaviors. They were becoming what he does, right? This is so fucking important, because the reason why you continue to fail is because decision fatigue is a real thing, on the neurological level as well. If you continue to do things out of mere discipline, you will just tire out and you will fail, you will regress, and you need these things to be part of what you want to do, guys. You should want to do these things. If you're disciplining yourself, there's probably something wrong with your fucking identity, and you need to fix that, or else you will continue to fail, because you only have limited power and limited resource before you just burn out, right? You need to be wanting to do these things. You shouldn't be disciplining yourself. You shouldn't feel like you need to be disciplined, right? I want to make this video. Like, genuinely. Again, these things are things that you should be excited for, the same way that so many people are excited to just go to clubs and get drunk. It's the same sort of idea, right? It's just two different identities. Cool. So weeks 11 to 17, advanced integration. And so in the following weeks, we deepen and widen the architecture. We upgraded to Salience tuning version 2, the process of recalibrating what your brain tags as important by focusing on the direct environment. For Marco, this meant shifting attention away from short-term dopamine cycles toward the subtle signals that actually move a life forward. Deep work windows, quality sleep, social opportunities, moments of avoidance. This was already developing far before this period, but salience tuning part 2 was really about dialing in his identity. And I don't know if I mentioned earlier, but salience tuning was initially deployed in week 4. Essentially what salience tuning is, just to put simply, is really just monitoring what's in your environment. Who are you following, right? Like, are you following fucking degenerates? If you are, best to just unfollow them right now. That is being fed into your subconscious mind, and your subconscious mind, I promise you, it remembers everything that you feed it, even though it doesn't feel like it on the conscious level, okay? And so we also examined identity thermostat dynamics with increased precision. Instead of simply asking, where did I act out of alignment, we analyzed which shadow part took control in that moment, what story did it tell, and what would future me have done with identical emotional conditions. This level of inquiry reveals how your psychological thermostat, the internal set point for what level of success, love, and power you unconsciously allow yourself to sustain, operates through specific shadow mechanisms that can be mapped and overridden, right? So I'm not going to really get into the Jungian shadow. I think it's way too complex for this video. I have another video. If you go to my Instagram and you find any of my shadow posts, if you comment shadow, you'll get that video. Just to put simply, is the shadow is the material that you've learned to suppress, the behaviors, the beliefs, the emotions that you've learned to suppress for one reason or another. Typically during your childhood, you learned that certain things were bad, certain things were good. These authentic expressions of yourself were suppressed into the shadow. But the thing is, they actually don't disappear. They form the shadow, in what Jung called the shadow. And this shadow projects onto the outer world, and the shadow has a very, very high chance of ruining your life if you don't actually address it directly through Jungian shadow work. Okay, yeah, but again, there's a lot of places to learn about the shadow, my account being one of them. And so the FSN versions 3 and 4 were created and rehearsed. Each version was not a new fantasy, but an updated rendering of the same identity, now informed by real evidence. Narrative and data were beginning to converge, which was, again, very fucking cool when your future self narrative begins to almost look like your current life, especially your first one, right? It's a pretty cool thing. Shadow integration intensified through additional sessions, cathartic releases, and permission expansion work, the process of widening the range of experiences you unconsciously allow yourself, more authority, more visibility, and more love. Again, this all has to come back to the Jungian shadow, but that's not the point of this video. This is more about just the protocols that were implemented for Marco. And so by this point, virtually all of Marco's negative behaviors were not only visible, but mapped. He could identify which parts of him were preparing to sabotage, what narrative it would employ, and which bodily sensations preceded it. This level of mapping destroys the mystery of self-sabotage, okay? So we're beginning to near the end. As you can see, this is now behavioral phase 3 is about to begin. This is cathartic release journaling 3 and 4, his salience tuning, etc. And then just like the advanced application of the identity statements, the reasons framework that I already explained. So weeks 20 to 22, comprehensive mapping and relapse immunity. Around week 20, the architecture had fundamentally shifted. We possessed a comprehensive understanding of the shadow material and its manifestations. All major negative behaviors had been studied and mapped, and urges that previously felt overwhelming were either absent or transparent, right? Meaning that overriding them required minimal effort. Chronic baseline stress, which had seemed permanent, dropped to nearly zero for Marco. The big thing though is, again, these urges that he used to have were pretty much just absent. He didn't care to eat fast food. He didn't care to go on his phone and scroll all night, because the soil had now changed. The behaviors, the plants are just fundamentally different that stem from that soil. That's the really important thing to know here. And again, this is just change on the neurological level, which is why he didn't care to engage in these regressive self-sabotaging behaviors, because he was just a different person. Just like a virtuous person doesn't want to do evil things naturally, not because they have the urge to do something evil and they are able to hold themselves back. They just don't care to do the evil thing, right? There's a big difference there. And so we completed Future Self Narrative 5. At this stage, right, and the later narratives, there's two ways of going about this, and I think both are great. One is where the narrative is no longer aspirational. It reads like a slightly time-shifted diary, which is pretty cool because you really achieved so much, and you can achieve so much in the span of 20 weeks and 6 months total. And then you can also give yourself the really long-term horizon future self narratives, which also Marco had in his other future self narratives, the long-term horizon ones, which map out your bigger goals, right? Because again, you can time-pace future self narratives once you get more advanced. By week 22, Marco had developed what I call identity relapse immunity. This does not mean he will never experience difficult days. It means his default identity has changed so completely that relapsing into his former life would require active and sustained choice. That's the big thing. And again, a lot of people get so scared about self-sabotaging and self-regressing, just like it's very difficult for you to achieve that higher version of yourself because your identity is somewhere else. The reason why it's hard, again, is because your brain needs to literally prune and destroy certain neural circuits and create new ones. That takes considerable work. But in the very same way, once you actually create that new brain, that new template, which looks significantly different from the initial brain that you had, it is also just as hard to regress back into that original brain, because you have to now prune all the new neural pathways that you created and recreate the old self-sabotaging patterns, right? This is why identity change is so beautiful, because it really does protect you from relapse. And so at this point, Marco possessed a fully mapped shadow with instant access to major shadow manifestations. He could navigate his internal landscape without external guidance, and he understood the mechanisms behind all of our interventions and experienced chronic stress as exceptional rather than constant. Full autonomy had begun. He was no longer following protocols, but operating his own inner architecture. And so I kind of just explained pretty much all of that right here. Now, the final weeks. So in the final phase, my role shifted from architect to consultant, which was really cool with all of my mentees. Marco began self-navigating his shadow work, initiating sessions when he noticed new projections or triggers. And again, he would initiate the sessions himself. He expanded his permissions independently, claiming more responsibility, visibility, and income. He applied advanced future self narrative techniques to businesses and relationships, and he designed his training, nutrition, and recovery with a deep understanding of how identity and physiology interact. By week 24, he graduated, not as someone who completed a program, but as someone who could legitimately architect his own identity. The external markers reflect this internal shift. And so he transformed from skinny fat to possessing a physique he once only observed and dreamt of having in others. He went from depressed to fulfilled with meaning. He went from a literal basement dweller to a fucking Chad. He went from socially awkward to genuinely charismatic. He went from a broke 9-to-5 student to 40K months. And he continues compounding because identity compounds precisely as capital does. It's the exact same idea. And so now this is what Marco looks like. And so again, just to kind of recap, the sequence does matter. Audits to diagnose, anchor, and integration, future self-narratives to install the anchor, shadow work to surface and map resistance, behavioral corrections to align action with vision, and advanced applications to actually inhabit the new level of existence. By the conclusion, Marco possessed not merely different habits, but a fundamentally different relationship to his own mind. Once that changes, the body, the bank account, and the social world follow in ways that no meal plan or productivity system could ever approach. This is the difference between self-improvement and identity architecture. One manages symptoms, the other reconstructs the foundation. Yeah, so this is Marco now, my boy. So proud of him. He's one of my best friends now, actually. As many of my mentees are, actually. All my mentees are fucking dope. Yeah, so pretty clear what type of guy Marco is now. He used to be broke, like I said, 9-to-5, vaping, and he would look forward to the vape breaks and the drink breaks. And now he has his dream Starbucks Rolex. I think it's like a Submariner. I don't even know Rolexes that well. And this is me and Marco. So I hope that made sense. I hope I provided some value for you guys, some clarity on how transformation actually looks on a tangible level. A lot of people like to gatekeep. I'm not one to do that. If you are more interested in actually working with me and actually doing something like this, do reach out on Instagram. Please do reach out. Just let me know that you actually came from this video. I would really appreciate it. So at least I know that you have some context. Don't come in with the expectation that my mentorship is cheap, please. That is, I think it's pretty clear now. I go very in depth with each person. So this is not just some $500 random course that you're going to take. It's something much more comprehensive. I go very in depth with each person, and I care deeply for each person's success, just like Marco's. And this is why all of my mentees, I can proudly say, are successful in their endeavors. So with that said, I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope I cleared some things up, and I look forward to seeing you soon. See you later.